My name is Oskar Swirtun, and I am the CEO and one of the founders of FossID. When we founded FossID, our initial goal was to help companies to innovate more with the help of open source and use it in such a way that it is okay with all the regulations related to the open source software. Myself, I have been working with open source software since around 2000, so it's 20 years now. I've always believed that open source helps companies to innovate. I remember I used to work in Ericsson in 2000, and at that point many people thought that it was difficult. You shouldn't use open source software in the development, but together with engineering we actually turned people around and got Ericsson to jump on the train and work a lot with open source software. And I think when I left Ericsson, maybe 10 years later, open source was what we used to call the biggest supplier of software to Ericsson at that time. And I think similar is valid for most other companies. And FossID, working today with companies in Europe, but also across the world, in Asia, Korea, of course, Japan, in US. We see that open source is becoming the new normal. You have to use open source, of course, and I mean, there's nothing new about it. But what is a little bit new is that even governments are now realizing that open source is very important for them to use and to engage. And I wanted to give, in this talk, I wanted to give a little bit of a European perspective of things. And I wanted to talk about how European Union is looking at open source and the open source strategy that European Commission has just presented. And also from our perspective to discuss how good compliance practices enable innovation. So recently European Commission has published a paper on open source strategy for European Union years 2020 to 2023. And there are particularly 2 points that I think are summarizing this document very well. The first one is about technological independence. And there the European Commission states that by using open source software, companies, and in this case governments even, will be able to work towards technological independence. There is so much knowledge software out there. So even if you're a company that maybe do not have a huge software department today, you can relatively easily start your development and use all the software that is available out there. I remember when we, again, long time ago in Ericsson, Linux was already well established. Linux was introduced to the world in 1991 already. And sometimes we refer to Linux as the biggest charity project that the Western world had had. Suddenly, when companies across the world, universities across the world, started contributing to the Linux project, what maybe was restricted to high-tech universities like MIT now was available to everyone. Anyone, anywhere in the world could suddenly just see how you build an operating system. And of course, if you have that knowledge, you can build your own technologies. So open source software is extremely important to build your technological independence, and it applies to any company. If you are a car manufacturer and you want to build your self-driving car, of course you don't start from scratch. use all that software that's available. The second point is about driving innovation, because of course when you contribute to open source, it's not just about giving your knowledge. You give your knowledge, but you also get feedback. And by getting that feedback, you actually increase your own knowledge. And it becomes an incremental, an iterative process based on sharing of the knowledge and skills between people. So this is kind of the two main pillars of that paper. And when you read through the document, you see that there are certain key guiding principles that EU is looking at. And I'm going to go through them and kind of have a short summary of what they kind of see. The first principle is for the European community and its member state to think open. And this is really about becoming an enthusiastic user and contributor to the open source community. So European Commission wants to make sure that the IT community within Europe works with open source software. It's a little bit of a state of mind. And open source solutions should be preferred when equivalent in functionalities, total cost and cybersecurity. This is a quote from the paper. The second point is about the culture and principles of openness. Here, European Commission wants to adopt the principle of openness that the open source community have been working with for so long. It's about sharing, reuse within organization, but also between organizations. And together to create a user-centric and data-driven public service. Next point, sharing, is about actually encouraging contributions. So it should be relatively easy for the developers to make contributions to the important projects that they work with. Whenever it makes sense, of course, this should be made possible and shouldn't be too difficult. And there is, I think the difference between now and before is that the people that want to contribute to these projects don't have to go through cumbersome processes of approval, but rather can just do it as long as these are projects related to the activities that the European Union is working on. Contribute is about being an active member of the ecosystem. It's not only about contributing code, but it's also about joining the boards of these projects, committees, and so on. So an active member, European Commission wants to be an active member of open source community, and in some cases potentially even drive some of those projects. So next point is about security. And of course this is an area where European Union has been working with for a long time, and they see that now working more with open source software, they need to make sure that whatever they contribute is free from vulnerabilities, and continuous testing is applied to everything that they contribute. They need to be a trustworthy member of this community and apply best known security practices. And the last point is about staying in control. And in this case, this is very much about this is very much what European Union is about. It's a number of member states, and they need to work with open standards, and interoperability is very important. Specifications need to be implemented and distributed in open source. So this is one point that is extremely important for a union of countries, union of states, as European Union is. So these are some of the points. And from here, I think it's important to consider how proper compliance process and tools can become like a safety net, allowing greater freedom to innovate. So if you think about compliance, many people think about policing your developers, but we believe that's the wrong approach. Innovation cannot be policed, because then you will kill it. What you need is to provide a safety net, so these developers can basically jump off the cliff, use any open source software project out there, and in case there are problems, we'll just catch them. Your processes will catch them, your tools will highlight the issues, and then you can work with them, rather than proactively limiting what they can do. So if compliance is safety net, we believe there are maybe two parts to this ideology or strategy. One is about the driving innovation, and the other one is about security and confidentiality where you're doing it. So if you look at how can you drive innovation when encouraging use of open source and working with your compliance, there are certain things that I'm going to talk about, and one of them open source footprint, then the size of the contributions that you want to use, and then automation. When I started working with open source software in around the year 2000, already then we've seen that there was a lot of open source software available, but the amount of open source software available today is just staggering. It becomes more and more complex to generate the correct bill of material for softwares. The volume of the open source software available out there is just incredible. If you have a limited knowledge base, it may be difficult to find certain open source software projects. They may not be as popular, so they are not in your knowledge base. They may still be upcoming and interesting from your developer point of view, but still, maybe they're not there. We know that there is somewhere around 100 million open source software projects out there. And many of the tools available maybe have knowledge bases of only 3, 4, 5 million projects in their knowledge bases. And in those cases, you need to be very strict in what projects you allow your developer to use. And that's when it becomes more of a policing tool rather than a safety net, because you want your developers to be able to use basically any open source project out there. Again, that's what innovation is about, going to doing something new. And this new open source project providing this functionality may just be used by a few students and maybe one other company that's working on it. But it still may be the right project for you. So it is important that the knowledge base in your tools is big enough so that you can discover basically any open source project that you would like to use. And then it becomes like a safety net. You just use whatever you want. So that drives innovation. So whatever contribution you would like to use, you may need a file, or you may just need a few lines of code. And this is how your tool should be working as well. If you have a coding question, maybe you go to Stack Overflow to find the answer to your question. We know these websites have become more and more important for developers, and if you find the answer there, there is probably a code snippet that you want to use, and just copy paste it into your code. And then your problem is solved. You can just continue on whatever you were doing, and the problem that you had didn't take hours to solve, maybe in some cases weeks. It took basically a few minutes because the solution was there and the snippet of code that you wanted to use is there. That's innovation. That's how you can innovate faster. That's how you can develop your products faster. Many security vulnerabilities can be identified by finding the vulnerable snippet. So if you have tools that can find snippet and actually identify a vulnerability to that snippet, then right from the start, you know, I probably shouldn't be copying that piece of code, and you go find your solution somewhere else. This is how we believe you can help developers. Being able to identify snippets of copied source code allows developers to use the code that they need and thus develop faster. Copy pasting is actually a very useful way and quick way to develop code, but then you need to be able to identify these copy pasted files. And by reuse, you drive innovation. And you reuse on any level you want. You can reuse a file, you can use a full component, and just a piece of code, few lines of code that are needed in your specific application. So again, safety net. You don't limit your developers what they can or cannot use. You allow them to use any size of the contribution, and it still be found and identified by your tools and processes, and you can and the developer can just go about doing what they do best, develop software. Of course, all these things need to be done automatically. Today, we're not using waterfall model, we're using agile way of developing. And in the same way, compliance needs to be integrated in your continuous integration, continuous development process. Basically, your developers should have real-time information about what licenses they have in their software, what potential security vulnerabilities they have, and only be contacted when there is an issue. If you develop, you take a piece of code and you right away get the information. This is a GPL software, and you know you are not allowed to use GPL software in your code, then you just go look for something else. You don't spend days on integrating that piece of software into your code. You just replace it. Or in some cases, you contact an expert and see, can I actually use it despite the fact that it's GPL? And maybe you can. But it should not be a process that have continuous stops when you have to go to a human and check, can I or can I not use this software? And then you have to wait for a few hours or a few days before you get an answer. It's much better to just, whenever you introduce a new software, you have the information about the licensing, you have the information about potential vulnerabilities right from start, and then you decide if you go ahead or if you go to somewhere else and try to find another software solving the same problem for you. So this is again a way to provide a safety net rather than providing limits to what your developers can or cannot do. And the second part of it, of course, when you're using software that's so open, security and confidentiality are important aspects of it. The first one is around supply chain compliance. Because when I started working with this around year 2000, for us, compliance work was something that we did internally. Of course, we had some suppliers that provided us with open source software. We had a company that we worked with around Linux, but most suppliers didn't provide long lists of open source software that they were using. And it was probably wrong at the time already, but it's even more wrong today. Because whenever you include a third-party software, we know that you include open source software. And any open source software that your suppliers include have licenses that you as a customer need to adhere to. And the same way, the vulnerabilities that your suppliers are introducing in the open source software that they are using are inherent to your product. This is extremely important, and we believe that this is probably the area where companies need to work most today, because most of the software that you're using in your product, you don't write. Your suppliers write most of your software. So as a car manufacturer, you maybe have, I don't know, 100 developers, 200, 500, but then all your suppliers together probably have more software developers, and they provide you with more software than what you build yourself. So this is really, in many ways, more important than internal compliance. So recently there was a new open chain ISO standard related to open source compliance. This hopefully will help companies to realize how important this is and will help to secure the supply chain. But I think already today there are good ways of checking how your suppliers perform, and basically they need to share the information about everything they use and potentially even hashes of their software with their customers, so that the customer can make sure that no unwanted licenses or security vulnerabilities come into play in their final products that they develop. So recently we have seen an increased popularity for offline deployment. So what FossID means by an offline deployment is basically that both the knowledge base and all the information about your project is stored within your company premises. This means that nothing related to compliance is ever sent outside of your premises. This has previously been used maybe only by a selected small number of very large companies, but we see that this is becoming more and more interesting. And we believe this is related to the fact that an exact software inventory is a potential attack vector. If a company discloses the information about exact what version of software they're using, a potential attacker can explore that specific version of the software to see if there are any vulnerabilities that they can explore. And even if there are no known vulnerabilities, we know that there are governments, many governments are behind cyber attacks today. And in many cases, the companies we work with critical infrastructures, or in some cases are supplying software to bigger companies that work with critical public infrastructure. And therefore, this data should probably not be shared across borders. So if you're using OpenSSL 1.001, anybody knows that potentially exposed to the Heartbleed vulnerability. And you probably patched it. But the information that you're actually using that specific software may still be explored in other ways. Maybe there are other vulnerabilities that are unknown, or maybe you can introduce one or find one. So that is why we have seen a bigger popularity in offline deployments, when basically the exact versions of the software that you're using are kept inside within your company premises and not shared outside of your company. And the last point related to confidentiality is around blind audits. FossID has until today been involved in merger and acquisition deals for around a little bit more than $40 billion. We believe one of the main reasons why these companies choose us to do the audit is that we never actually see the source code. And of course, if you are a company being acquired, the main asset that you have is your software. So you don't want to share your asset with the buyer, at least not until they've paid. So this has helped us to take a relatively big piece of this market, and we work with a number of companies, customers across the world in the merger and acquisition audits. This confidentiality requirement is particularly strict when we work with publicly traded companies, when publicly traded companies are being bought. At that point, especially in the US, these companies have extreme confidentiality requirements because, of course, any knowledge of this would allow insider trading, which is, of course, illegal. So in some cases, we make sure that not even our auditors know what companies they are reviewing code from. So in many of these cases, there are only two people within FossID that know what company is being bought. This is, of course, one of the things that we do, and we believe that limiting the distribution of information is the best implementation of confidentiality. And what we also see that this kind of blind audit allows us to, or our customers to, audit their suppliers without seeing their source code, which is also an important aspect, again, when you're trying to secure your supply chain. So, as a few final words, as I mentioned in the beginning, I believe that good compliance practices enable innovation. And I think there are two main things that I would like maybe you to take from this talk. The first one is about technological independence. I do believe that open source can help companies and even governments to reach technological independence. There is so much software out there that you are free to use, that you can really build your solutions upon that software, and you can be the master of your own future, of your product when you use open source, as long as you use it in a good way. And to do that, you need to make sure that you have compliance processes that allow you to use that open source software, and that your compliance processes help you to drive the innovation rather than put hinders in the way for your innovation, make it more difficult for your developers. So I think these are the two main points that I want to make, and I hope you will visit our website. You can read more about FossID, our products, and thank you very much.